Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining Inspirit for our event, The Walking Dead versus Biology. I'm Nadine from Inspirit, and yes, that's right. Today we're going to be learning all about DNA, how it replicates, and then what that means for the possibility of an actual zombie apocalypse. Inspirit VR is a 3D STEM learning platform that makes learning science online fun. So if you're a self-proclaimed science nerd, or even if you just want to improve your biology or chemistry grades, come check our website out and make sure you join our Discord group, students only. So getting back to zombies. In this session, we will have 3 parts in the Name of the Living Dead investigation. Part 1, we'll learn all about DNA replication by playing Inspirit simulation. Then part 2, we'll have a challenge mode. You'll be testing your knowledge with our DNA replication challenge, and I want to see what kind of score you can get. Then, finally, part 3, you'll hear from the experts. Inspirit's co-founder Aditya will walk you through some real-life examples of zombification, and you'll have to decide whether or not there could actually be a zombie apocalypse in the world. All right, so to get started, I want you to go to www.dnareplicationsimulation.com. This is going to take you to Inspirit's DNA replication simulation. So feel free to put this video on pause, go check out the simulation, complete it, all while keeping in the back of your mind zombies and DNA and what this could all mean. Then come back here when you've finished. I'll wait. All right, now that you've shrunk it down to a tiny speck and seen DNA replication up close and personal, it's time to test your knowledge. Go to this website or scan the QR code to test your DNA replication knowledge. Read through the study guide, use your simulation knowledge, and then see what kind of score you come back. Feel free to pause this video, and I'll be here when you come back. All right, so now that you're a DNA expert, let's see what Aditya has to say about the possibility of a real-life zombie apocalypse someday.
Hi everyone, my name is Aditya, and today we're going to be talking about whether there could be a zombie apocalypse in the real world. So here we are in our magical science library, and we're going to go through a bunch of fascinating 3D experiences trying to unpack this very interesting question. So let's start with an even more fundamental question first. What even is a zombie? Scientifically speaking, a zombie is an organism that does not have a will of its own. Somehow it has been reanimated in some kind. And most of you must be thinking that zombies are just folk tales. But what if I told you that scientists currently have been very deeply studying this topic and looking at instances of zombie-like behavior in the natural world? We are actually closer to understanding this than many of you might even realize. And I'm really excited to kind of give you a sneak peek, an extremely short sneak peek into what some of the latest science says about this. So let's start off with a couple of very common organisms that some of you may have seen in nature and definitely on the internet that exhibit zombie-like behavior. Right here that you see in front of you is a starfish. Starfishes, there was a very interesting zombie incident back in 2015 where a so-called zombie apocalypse in starfish was widely reported across specific species of starfish in the Great Barrier Reef, which is off the coast of Australia. Starfish all around the globe, and specifically in this region, started behaving really weirdly after being affected by a very specific virus. And scientists were really unable to identify the nature of the virus, but the behavior that the starfish exhibited was categorized as zombie-like. Essentially, what was happening was the starfish started tearing themselves apart until they essentially died. They would detach the arms, each of these arms that the starfish possesses here. You can see typically they have 5 arms in this 5-pointed star-like fashion. And each of these arms, if you look at the rear side over here, there's the entire nervous system that goes towards the end of every single arm of the starfish. Each of these arms were voluntarily detached by the starfish, and then the arms started taking a life of their own. These arms would wiggle and squiggle, and they could eventually regenerate the rest of the starfish. Now, there is an important point to clarify here, which some of you might already be thinking about. Starfish can detach their arms at their own will. This phenomenon has a name. It's called autotomy. And it's something that happens very often in starfish. They do this when they want to escape a predator, and they do this in many other cases when an arm gets damaged for some reason, for example, to protect the rest of the body. But they only do this when they have to perform certain fight or flight or other defense mechanisms. Sometimes even during reproduction, these things happen. But during this so-called apocalypse, these weren't the cases. Starfish precisely just tore themselves to pieces and then essentially died. A similar case was reported among certain kinds of ants. So what you have over here is a very rudimentary model of a fungus or a mushroom, which is what the structural fungus actually looks like. In very broad terms, fungi, which is the plural of fungus, are organisms that eat dead organic material. So you'll see fungus grows on usually on places that are moist and that have moisture and food available. So bread mold is a very common place where you might have seen fungus if you leave bread for too long in the fridge. Fungi reproduce. The way they reproduce is, if you look at the underside of this fungus over here, they have a bunch of tiny seeds called spores. And these spores are released by the fungus into the air. Thousands and thousands of these spores are released. And then they travel through the air and through other forces of nature, and they get dispersed, and they lead to the reproduction of these fungi in far and wide places. Spores of one very specific fungus are actually very deadly to ants. These fungi are actually called Cordyceps, which is again just a type of fungus that you should know about. And I have an image over here of what happens is these fungi actually grow and they completely take over the entire nervous system of the ants if they are able to breach into the exoskeleton or the outer skeleton of the ants. And they essentially flood the ant's brain and the nervous system with chemicals, the roots of the fungus. And I'll try to zoom in as much as possible here. But the roots of the fungus infiltrate every single fiber of muscle in the ant's body and take over complete control. So what this means is essentially the ant is alive, but the ant essentially starts functioning without a brain, almost zombie-like, because the fungus has in many ways hijacked the entire system of the ant. On a scary note, some recent research has also shown that this Cordyceps fungus evolves and is able to actually affect other creatures, other very small, tiny insects like ants as well. So just imagine this scenario where we have certain organisms that have the ability through chemicals to take over the nervous system, to take over the nerves, the brain, and the motor functions of a body, and therefore essentially make it seem as if the organism has lost complete control of itself. So I have a question for all of you, and this is an interesting question that that may come naturally to some of you as well. If this were possible in humans, and today we haven't identified an organism or an equivalent of this sort of fungus that can do this in humans, but imagine if there was a fungus of some kind that had the ability to hijack the nervous system of humans. Question for all of you: what would happen to the DNA? What would happen to the fundamental blueprint determining structure of the human body, DNA, which determines what your hair color is, what your eye color is, and is responsible for the transfer of genetic information, hereditary information from one generation to the other? It's actually interesting. Nothing happens to the DNA, and here we have a very classic 3D model of the DNA, which many of you may have seen. I'm just going to angle myself properly for you to take a look at this. Here we go. So the DNA has two vertical strands that are wrapped in a helix, and then you have these horizontal rungs of a ladder, almost like a ladder. And DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. This is what is present inside the nucleus of every single cell in your body. Surprising answer is nothing actually happens to the DNA, because the organism that would potentially turn you into a zombie would be using its own DNA. The fungus has its own DNA, and it's using its own DNA to make decisions and to drive what should be happening to the organism that it has taken over. Your DNA actually would not be affected per se. It is your nervous system that gets affected in most cases, because that's what is responsible for reactions, motor movement, and motor controls. And that's how this entire system would work. And so to wrap up, I want to wrap up with an interesting question then. So if this were to happen in the real world, some sort of a zombie apocalypse, what is the scientific method that one would have to take to defeat this? How would you actually defeat a zombie? And you may have seen a lot of wacky ideas that movies may be presenting to you on how one should defeat a zombie if you have a zombie apocalypse or a zombie attack. But it's actually a very, very basic principle of physics that one can employ to stop or to end a zombie apocalypse. And the answer is just by starving them. You know that energy is conserved in this universe, the law of conservation of energy. And so, even though a zombie might be quote unquote dead, it would require some sort of nutrition to acquire energy to move. So, if there is a way to isolate a zombie and starve them, essentially they're going to die over a period of time. And if you look at these examples right here, right, this fungus that goes and infests a bread mold, or this fungus that goes and infests this ant, it is feeding off of the nutrition, the food, the other materials present in that mold of bread, in that ant. And the moment it runs out of that, unless it finds a way to reproduce or move on or grow into any other organism, it is going to die. And so the way to prevent something like this from spreading is to essentially isolate these organisms and separate them from everybody else. And over time, they will run out of nutrition and they will die. This is quite contrary to what you will see in many movies that will say that zombies are immortal. That is not the case. They require constant nutrition to survive, because finally they are moving, and to move, you require energy. So I hope you learned something interesting today, both about how certain fungi act when they are able to hijack nervous systems of organisms, and what hypothetically an apocalypse of some sort could look like. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future 3D interactive lesson. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in today, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit more about DNA and zombies with InspiritVR.com. Find even more resources for biology, chemistry, and physics on our site. And don't forget to join our Discord group too.